The gift and the insult. Jace Morgan never imagined that one day he would be called into the marble halls of an alien noble. But here he was standing under the cold silver glow of the twin moons of Velkaris, the frontier world, where humans were treated as little more than hired tools. The air was thick with perfume and mockery, as alien courtiers whispered and pointed at the lone human dressed in the plain gray uniform of a salvage engineer. His hands were rough, from years of building broken machines. For the very same nobles who now laughed at him, Jace had repaired half the power systems in the Baron's territory, yet none of them saw him as anything more than a curiosity. At the far end of the Grand Hall, Baron Kovric lounged on his hovering throne, his scaled face gleaming with amusement. His voice rolled through the hall like thunder when he announced that he had decided to reward the human for his hard work. And as the courtiers laughed even before the words were finished, Jace felt the weight of something cruel in the air. The Baron gestured, and two guards wheeled in a chair, an ornate chair of gold and crystal, and upon it sat a girl, her limbs motionless, her head tilted slightly, her pale eyes reflecting the torches around. Her, the Baron said, "This is my daughter Sarai, the jewel of my house. Though some say the jewel has lost its shine since the accident. Take her, human. You like to fix things. Perhaps you can fix this one." The laughter exploded around Jace like gunfire, but he did not look at the Baron or the crowd. His eyes went to the girl, and in that moment the hall seemed to fade. The girl did not laugh, she did not cry. She only looked at him with a calm that held no shame, no fear, only something else. Something, searching. He walked closer and bowed not to the Baron but to her. His voice was quiet when he said, "My name is Jace. I will take care of you if you allow me." She did not answer, but her eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate, and Jace understood that. She had heard him when the guards rolled the chair out of the hall and the crowd jeered behind them. Jace followed without a word. They took her to the servants' quarter, a place meant for waste and forgotten tools, not for a noble daughter. The guards dropped her things at the door and left laughing about how a human nurse would keep the Baron entertained for weeks. Jace waited until the sound of their boots vanished, then turned to the girl. Her breathing was steady, her skin faintly luminescent, with the soft sheen of her kind. He crouched beside her and said softly, "You are not a joke to me. Sarai, whatever they did to you, we will find a way." That night Jace worked by the flicker of his portable lamp, studying the strange medical frame that surrounded her. The alien design was delicate but inefficient. It supported her body but sent conflicting neural impulses that made her muscles twitch at random. He disconnected the power conduits, and her face relaxed for the first time in what might have been years. He found small scars along her neck near the spinal ports, scars that spoke of surgery and control, not healing. He whispered almost to himself. They did this to her. For days. Jace worked in secret cleaning, her room, replacing her broken systems, building a small lab from scrap. He talked to her while he worked, telling her about the human colonies, about the stars and the ships that roamed between them. She could not answer, but sometimes her fingers moved a little when he spoke about freedom. He began to recognize the pattern of her blinks and gestures, a language made of patience and observation, and soon he could tell when she was happy or when she was trying to warn him that someone was coming. One evening, as he adjusted a sensor on her chair, he noticed a faint pulse of light at the base of her spine. He traced it to a control chip woven into her nervous lattice. It was connected not to her body, but to an external signal that came from the palace core. This was no medical implant. It was a governor, a limiter designed to suppress motion. Jace felt his stomach turn as he realized she had not been born paralyzed. She had been made this way. The Baron had imprisoned his own daughter inside her body, and then given her away as an insult. That night Jace could not sleep. He sat by the window of the tiny workshop, staring at the alien city that glowed across the valley. Every light out there ran on systems he had built for them, yet he was treated as a thing less than a machine. And now he was holding the life of a young woman who had been punished for reasons he could not yet understand. He made a vow under the whispering sky that he would find a way to free her, not only because it was right, but because in her silent gaze he saw the same fire that humans once carried when they first crossed the void. When morning came, he found Sarai watching him, her eyes alert as if she had waited all night for him to speak. He said quietly, "Think I know what they did to you, and I think I can change it, but you have to trust me." She blinked twice slowly, the signal he had learned for yes. He smiled for the first time since arriving on this world and said, "Then we begin today." He started, scavenging parts from discarded drones and old exosuits, building a crude diagnostic rig from human tech, fused with alien interfaces. Every piece of wire he soldered felt like defiance against a world that believed humans could not think beyond what they were told. By the time the second night fell, Sarai's breathing had steadied, her color brighter, her gaze sharper. Jace felt hope creeping into the cold room. He did not yet know that the path ahead would lead them into rebellion and danger, and that this small act of kindness would soon ignite a fire across the barony. But for now, all that mattered was that he had seen her not as a burden, not as a joke, but as a person waiting to stand again. Sparks in silent nerves, Jace worked through the following days with the patience of a craftsman who knew that every small act mattered. He built his small lab around Sarai's chair using pieces of scrap and old tools that most engineers would have thrown away. There was a rhythm to his work now, the hum of solder, the faint hiss of circuits being tested, the quiet pulse of life slowly returning to the space. They had no one but each other, in that narrow corner of the servants' wing, where no noble would ever think to look. He spoke, as he worked, not because he expected answers, but because he wanted her to hear a voice that was not cruel or filled with laughter at her pain. Sarai listened, and her eyes followed every movement he made, as if learning through sight alone. She began to communicate in small but precise gestures, a flick of her fingers, a blink, in a pattern that Jace could read after hours of watching her. Every signal had meaning, and soon he could tell when she wanted to rest, when she was amused, or when she was warning him of footsteps in the corridor. He learned that she was more than intelligent. She was strategic. She had grown up in a court of schemes and whispers, and even without speech she had mastered survival through silence. One evening, Jace noticed a strange pulse of light running through the thin lines of her spine. It was rhythmic and deliberate, as if waiting for a command. He traced it back to a data port near her neck and realized it was sending small bursts of energy outward, not inward. The chip he had found earlier was not a dead piece of machinery, but part of a network, one that connected to the Baron's central control system. Through this link, Sarai's body was constantly being suppressed, every nerve impulse dampened, by coded feedback designed to make sure she could never move more than a few faint twitches. The discovery filled him with anger, but also determination. He scavenged deeper into the industrial yards behind the palace, gathering old human medical rigs from the days when frontier miners were treated by their own kind. He found exo braces used for spinal repair and powered prosthetics, once meant for heavy labor. From these parts, he built a new frame, a hybrid of human and alien design, slim, enough to fit under Sarai's dress and strong enough to amplify her smallest motion. He hid his work beneath layers of cloth when guards passed by, smiling like a fool when they mocked him for playing with broken toys. When the device was ready, Jace carefully slid it around her legs and arms. He told her to focus on moving one finger, and when she did, the frame hummed softly, translating the faint electrical whisper of her will into motion. Her index finger trembled, then lifted. For the first time in years, she froze her eyes wide as if afraid the moment would vanish. And then she blinked, twice the signal for astonishment and joy. Jace felt a lump in his throat and said quietly, "You did that, Sarai. You moved it yourself." Each day after that they practiced. She learned how to move her hand, then her wrist, then her arm. The exo frame responded more smoothly each time, adapting to her neural rhythm. The signals that once were weak became stronger, as if her body remembered what it was to live. Jace modified the rig, constantly tuning it to her pulse and temperature, and soon she could lift her arm without assistance for several seconds at a time. It was not yet walking, but it was a beginning, and every beginning felt like rebellion against the chains that held them. During one of their silent evenings, Sarai blinked a slow pattern that Jace did not understand at first. Then she blinked again twice, then paused, then 3 times. He realized she was spelling something in the old, human code he had once used in training. He fetched a small screen and connected it to her chair, allowing her to send text through minimal muscle input. The first words she managed to write were simple but powerful. "I am awake." Jace felt tears burn his eyes as he read them, and he said softly, "You have always been awake, they just refuse to see it." As the days passed, she began to teach him things in return. She knew the palace layout, the corridors, the servants' routes, and the secret pathways used by spies and nobles. She showed him where the power conduits of the barony's crest network ran, and told him, breaking the collar. The nights on Velkaris grew longer and colder as Jace continued his hidden work under the dim lights of the workshop. He slept only in brief moments when exhaustion forced his eyes shut, but even then his dreams were full of Sarai's quiet face and the memory of her first trembling movement. Each day he learned something new about the device buried inside her spine, and the deeper he went, the clearer the cruelty became. The chip was not meant for healing. It was a collar, a governor linked to the barony's crest network that kept her nerves in permanent submission. Its code was built on alien biologic, encrypted with family keys that no human was ever meant to understand. But Jace was not a man who stopped at walls. He only saw them as another kind of machine waiting to be dismantled. He began to study the alien scriptures that acted as both law and circuitry on Velkaris. The Baron's priests claimed their designs were sacred, but to Jace they were nothing more than complex systems of command dressed in ritual. The more he studied, the more he saw patterns familiar to human neural coding. He realized the chip in Sarai's spine spoke in 2 tongues, one biological, one digital. If he could build a bridge between them, perhaps he could fool it into releasing her control for even a moment, and that would be enough to break its authority forever. Sarai watched him as he worked, her eyes following every flicker of the tools. Her body still weak, but her mind sharper each day. She began to communicate faster through her improvised text system, describing symbols from the noble archives that Jace had never seen. She told him of the priest engineers who visited her after her mother's death, how they whispered about purification and divine order, and how one night she woke unable to move while they prayed over her still body. They told the court she was cursed, and the Baron had believed them, or perhaps he had wanted to believe them, so that he could claim her inheritance for himself. Jace read her words and felt a slow, burning fury rise within him. The Baron's cruelty had not been born of grief, but greed. The breakthrough came one night when Jace was experimenting with a piece of human biotech, a key seed once used to unlock military implants. The device had been banned for decades after a war, where too many soldiers had lost their minds merging with machines. But Jace saw another purpose in it. He tuned the seed to a soft pulse pattern matching the rhythm of Sarai's heart, and inserted it into the connection port behind her neck. The reaction was immediate. A surge of light running down her spine, followed by a gasp that sounded like life returning. She convulsed for a moment, and Jace held her steady, whispering calm words, until her breathing slowed. When she opened her eyes again, tears shimmered at their corners, and she lifted her arm higher than ever before. The governor chip had not been destroyed, but it had been fooled. The seed created a false signal that convinced the barony's crest network that Sarai was still immobilized, even as her nervous system regained fragments of control. It was a fragile victory, yet for the first time since the accident, she could move her head freely, and even lift her hand to touch Jace's face. The simple act nearly broke him. He caught her hand gently and said, "You are winning, Sarai," and she blinked once for yes. But victory carried risk. The same night that Sarai's movement returned, the palace security detected irregular energy flows from the crest network. The Baron's spy master, a cold figure named Voran, began tracing the anomaly through the lower districts. He was a creature of precision, half flesh, half metal, with a mind built to hunt secrets, and he had always hated the human engineer who dared speak directly to the Baron's daughter. Rumors spread quickly through the court that Jace was experimenting with forbidden human science, and that he was trying to raise the dead princess from her holy sleep. Jace knew they would come for him soon, so he began preparing escape routes. He mapped tunnels through the maintenance shafts and built false walls in the workshop to hide Sarai's chair. He also modified the exoframe again, making it lighter and quieter so she could move without drawing attention. The frame hummed with soft power as Sarai practiced taking weight on her legs, her arms shaking from the strain. Her every step was an act of defiance, and each small success filled Jace with something fierce and bright. Like hope turned to fire. On the 7th night she stood unaided for the span of a single breath, then fell forward into Jace's arms, laughing in silence, her body trembling from effort, but her eyes alive with pride. He held her and whispered, "This is only the beginning. You will walk the halls they denied you, and they will bow when you pass." Her lips moved, trying to form sound for the first time, but only air came out. Still, it was enough to make him believe she would one day speak again. When dawn came, Jace left the workshop disguised as a maintenance worker and slipped into the market district to gather new components. He felt eyes on him everywhere, the weight of suspicion thick in the streets. The noble servants avoided him, the merchants whispered, and he saw the shadow of the spymaster on the far ridge watching with lenses that glowed red. He returned by night through a hidden tunnel carrying what he needed: a power core from a crashed probe and a small generator that would let them sever the governor chip completely. When the time came, back in the workshop, Sarai was waiting seated upright, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She had been monitoring the palace network through the cracked screen, and she had seen the alerts spreading closer. She spelled out 2 words. To him, "Hurry soon." Jace nodded, and began to assemble the final phase of their plan. The new rig would send a magnetic surge through her spinal lattice strong enough to destroy the chip, but it would also alert every sensor in the palace if the signal was not masked perfectly. He adjusted frequency after frequency, sweating as he worked while Sarai kept her gaze steady on him, as if lending strength through sheer will. When everything was ready, Jace looked at her one last time and asked, "Do you trust me?" She blinked twice. He pressed the activation key and a wave of light filled the room like dawn breaking underwater. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Sarai arched her back and screamed, though her voice was only a ragged whisper as the governor chip shattered inside her. The Crest network registered silence, believing her still under its control. The link was broken. The collar was gone. She collapsed against Jace, trembling but alive, free in a way she had not been since childhood. Outside, the first alarms began to echo through the palace corridors as Voran, the spymaster, detected the anomaly again. The hunt had begun, but Jace did not care. In that moment, he saw Sarai lift both arms to embrace him, not as a patient or a burden, but as a being reborn into her own power. And he knew that whatever came next, no force on Velkaris would stop them now, because she had broken her chains, and so had he. Breaking the collar, Jace had not seen the sun in days. The small window above the workshop had long been covered with sheets of alloy to block the scanners that passed overhead. The air smelled of oil metal and faint traces of the herbs. Sarai liked him to burn when the pain in her spine grew worse. The room had become a world of its own, separate from the cruel laughter of the court beyond its walls. He lived for the sound of her breath and the faint electrical hum of the machines that surrounded her body. For Jace, there was no longer any barrier between his work and his purpose. The same hands that once repaired broken hulls of mining ships now sought to rebuild the spark that tyranny had stolen from a single girl. He spent each hour tracing the pulse of energy that ran along the thin network of lines beneath Sarai's skin. Like rivers of dim light, the alien priests had made the governor chip to feed on the very life it suppressed, drawing on her nervous system and sending false signals to keep her muscles quiet. It was a thing of both cruelty and brilliance, a design meant not to kill but to enslave. Jace understood that it was tied to the barony's Crest network, the same system that managed power distribution, communications, and control over every noble device on the moon, which meant that if he wanted to free her, he would have to break into the most sacred system of them all. He worked with fragments of old human technology scavenged from abandoned ships and forgotten mines. His tools were worn and outdated, but his mind was not. He built an interface that could translate the alien biosignals into human code, slowly merging two sciences that had never been meant to coexist. Every mistake brought pain to Sarai, and guilt to him, but she never blinked for him to stop. Her eyes remained calm, watching him with the patience of someone who had already survived the worst pain imaginable. She communicated through her blinks and fingers, and when his frustration grew heavy, she spelled a single word enough to silence his self-doubt faith. Each day, he grew closer to understanding how the chip thought its design was recursive, always rewriting itself when tampered with, like a living organism protecting its secret. Jace realized that the only way to defeat it was to mimic its nature, rather than attack it directly. He needed to speak its language not in commands but in rhythm. His hands shook from fatigue, but he steadied them, remembering the human phrase that had driven him since childhood. Machines are only as powerful as the man who refuses to surrender to them. Sarai's progress came in sudden waves one morning as he adjusted the exoframe around her neck. She moved her fingers with a fluid grace that startled even him. The small motion felt like thunder rolling through the silence of the room. He caught her hand in his and she looked at him with a quiet fire. He knew that once the chain was broken, she would never let herself be caged again. But the danger was growing faster than their hope. The Baron spy master Varan had begun tracing strange fluctuations in the network system, his suspicion of the human engineer spreading like rot through the court. That night, Jace made the final decision. He retrieved from his toolbox a forbidden artifact, the key seed, an old piece of human biotech used in wars long past, capable of resonating with biomechanical systems and rewriting their base rhythm. It had been banned because it could unmake minds, but he no longer cared. The only mind he meant to touch was already held captive. He tuned the seed to Sarai's heartbeat, his own breath syncing with hers as if to merge their rhythms into one, and then with careful precision he connected it to the small port hidden beneath the silver strands of her hair. The moment it linked, a surge of living energy rippled through the room. Light flowed from her spine to her fingertips like molten rivers. She gasped, her body shaking uncontrollably. Jace held her shoulders, whispering soft words to ground her, though no sound came out of her mouth. The struggle lasted only a few moments before the light dimmed, leaving a silence that felt impossibly deep. And then she turned her head to look at him fully. For the first time, her voice no more, then a broken breath yet filled with meaning. She said, "My name is Sarai," and Jace felt tears burn behind his eyes because it was the first sound he had ever heard from her, and it was more powerful than any speech. The governor chip had been deceived, not destroyed. The key seed had overwritten its report signal, making the Crest network believe she was still inert, even as her body reclaimed fragments of control. Jace knew this would not last forever. The deception would hold for days, maybe weeks, before the system caught the mismatch, but those days would be enough to finish what he had started. Sarai began standing with the support of the exoframe, her balance unsteady, yet determined. Each time she fell, she forced herself back upright, her breathing harsh but steady, as if the act of defiance alone gave her strength. Jace modified the frame with a micro-stabilizer, allowing her to move across the room step by step, while the faint whine of servos echoed off the metal walls. He watched her progress with a mixture of awe and dread, because each movement was a miracle but also a risk. The Crest network still pulsed faintly in her spine, like a distant heartbeat reminding him that their freedom was not yet complete. Sometimes, when she walked too far, alarms would flicker across his monitors, forcing him to shut down the system before detection. Outside their hidden sanctuary, the palace seethed with whispers. The Baron's court spoke of omens and forbidden science. The priests muttered prayers to ward off human contamination, and the spymaster moved his pieces in silence, searching for the source of the irregularities. Jace ignored the rumors, but Sarai did not. She began using the screen to teach him about the secret routes that threaded through the palace, the blind corridors, the forgotten maintenance shafts built centuries ago by slaves. She remembered everything and shared it with precision. Her knowledge of the palace was not only memory, it was inheritance, and Jace began to realize she was not merely trying to walk. She was preparing for something greater. Late one night, after another long session of training, she stood without the frame for several seconds, and when she began to fall, Jace caught her. She looked at him with a steady gaze and whispered through trembling lips, "I will walk into my father's hall one day, and they will see what they tried to bury." He answered without hesitation, "Then we will make them see together." The stars beyond the window flickered as if the universe itself had heard their vow in that moment. The bond between them became something more than patient and healer, or maker and machine. It was the quiet merging of two wills, born from the same hunger for freedom. The governor, Chip might still live inside her, but its control was fading, every pulse weaker than the last. And as the faint hum of her restored nerves filled the air, Jace knew the collar that had defined her existence was breaking, not just in her body, but across the web of fear that had bound both of them to the Baron's cruelty. And in that silence between their breaths, he understood that this victory was only the beginning of the storm to come. The air in the shadows. The moon of Velcaris turned blood, red when the twin suns dipped beyond its edge and the long night returned to the barony. The people called it the season of Veil, when shadows grew thick and secrets walked in daylight within that shifting darkness. Jace and Sarai continued their work, hidden in the narrow heart of the palace under the humming pipes that carried life to the halls above. Her progress was astonishing. She could now walk small distances without the full support of the frame, though each step trembled as if the air itself resisted her will. Her face glowed with quiet pride and her eyes burned with purpose. Jace had noticed the change in her tone of communication. She no longer spoke of recovery, but of reclamation. She asked about the Crest network, its access points, its power cores, and the route that linked it to the vault of the priest engineers. Jace had heard of that vault, only in whispers. It was the holy chamber beneath the temple, where the minds of the noble heirs were preserved in crystalline. Matrices the priest claimed it was to protect the bloodlines. But Sarai had begun to remember things that made him doubt everything she remembered being taken there as a child. Her mother still alive. Her father absent. She remembered the sound of chants and cold hands pressing against her spine. She remembered pain so deep it split her thoughts in two. And when she awoke, the paralysis had begun. Jace listened to these fragments and felt the pattern forming in his mind. The priests had done something to her far beyond cruelty. They had taken her right to rule and buried it under the mask of a curse. Sarai began teaching Jace the ways of the noble code, how messages were hidden in art, and how power flowed through alliances written in symbols, not words. She showed him how each family had a sigil woven into the Crest network, and how her own had been locked out by a command signed by her father, but countersigned by the high priest. This meant that the order to cripple her had not come only from the Baron himself. It had been sanctioned by the very system meant to preserve divine law. The realization sickened Jace, but it also gave him a target. If he could access that vault and retrieve the original record of the command, he could prove her innocence and destroy the lie that kept her imprisoned. They began to plan their heist in whispers and blinks. The Festival of Unity was approaching a grand night when every noble and priest would gather in the central hall to honor the founding of the barony. The guards would be drunk, the halls filled with music, and no one would notice a pair of shadows slipping into the temple below. Jace memorized every map Sarai drew from memory and constructed a new exo-frame disguised as ceremonial armor, slim and silver with delicate joints designed to move without sound. He embedded a stealth field within it, using pieces scavenged from a cloaking drone. The device shimmered faintly like heat waves when active, and Sarai could pass through corridors unseen as long as she kept her movements measured. The days leading to the festival were thick with tension. The spymaster Voran had increased patrols across the palace. The energy fluctuations from the broken Governor Chip were still echoing through the Crest network, and he could sense that something was out of balance. He questioned Jace in passing, once his artificial eyes scanning for deceit, but the human smiled and spoke in the calm tone of a loyal mechanic. The spymaster moved on, but not without suspicion. Sarai watched every move through the palace sensors she had hacked in secret, her control over the system growing stronger. With each hour she was reclaiming not only her body, but her birthright. When the night of the festival came, the palace was transformed. Music echoed across marble corridors and fountains. Spilled silver wine nobles draped in jeweled robes danced under banners of gold and violet. The Baron himself stood upon the grand dais, his laughter booming as he toasted the prosperity of his house, while below the revelers bowed and feasted. Yet beneath all this splendor, the temple chambers were nearly deserted, the priests occupied with rituals of blessing above their sacred Machinery silent and unguarded, it was the perfect time. Jace and Sarai moved through the maintenance shafts, silent as ghosts. The stealth field wrapped around them like a dream, their path illuminated only by the faint pulse of her spinal light. They reached the sealed doors of the temple vault carved with glyphs that shimmered with energy. Sarai placed her hand on the sigil of her house, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone glowed faintly, responding to her long-forgotten command. She whispered her own name as the phrase of entry, and the door opened with a sound like a sigh, releasing the air of centuries inside the vault. The walls were lined with crystalline pillars, each one humming with faint light within them floated. Echoes of consciousness, fragments of thought and memory from every noble heir who had ever lived. Jace felt the hair on his neck rise as he realized he was standing among the ghosts of generations. Sarai walked forward, her steps steady, guided by some instinct deep within her. She stopped before a small crystal chamber marked with her sigil, and beneath it a series of inscriptions that looked more like a verdict than a name. She pressed her. The war has just begun, and in that moment, as the palace trembled and the people of Velkaris began to question everything, Jace understood that this was no longer just a mission to heal one broken body. It was the birth of a revolution wrapped in the name of a girl who had refused to stay paralyzed, stand of the human and the air. The palace of Velkaris had never known such noise or such silence. The moment the truth burst across the crest network, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, and then erupted in chaos. Nobles screamed, guards shouted, priests prayed to gods that no longer answered them. For the first time in 100 years, the system of power that held every life in submission had cracked, and through that fracture light began to pour like fire. Jace and Sarai stood at the edge of the lower terrace, looking up at the sky as the holographic images of betrayal still played across the heavens. The Baron's name burning in shame, while the face of his daughter, once scorned, now looked down upon every corner of the moon, her eyes steady and filled with the calm fury of truth. They did not have long before the soldiers began to sweep the lower halls, searching for the human traitor and the cursed heir. Jace led her through the smoke and down the path toward the old foundry where he had once worked before being forced into servitude. There the workers still toiled under the weight of the barony's taxes and cruel overseers. Jace had friends among them, humans and aliens, both beaten but not broken. When he burst through the doors with Sarai at his side, the workers froze, unsure if they were seeing truth or dream. She stepped forward, supported by her frame, her voice rough, yet clear. The priests lied to you. My father lied to you. They called me cursed, so you would bow to them, and they called you less than living, so you would never rise. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the daughter of the Baron stood before them, breathing, trembling, alive. Jace took a step forward. His hands raised. This woman, he said, was given to me as a joke. They thought a human would only fail. But she has shown me what none of them ever understood. Power does not come from blood or title. It comes from will. From hands that refuse to stop building even when everything is taken from them. The workers began to murmur, the sound growing like wind through dry leaves, until one voice shouted for the air, and then another and another. Soon the old foundry echoed, with their cries, the sound of a people remembering that they still had voices. Above them, the Baron's guards moved through the corridors under the command of the spymaster Voran, who, despite his injuries, refused to fall. His mechanical frame limped, but his fury gave him strength. He swore that he would end the human and the girl before dawn. He gathered the priests and the loyal nobles, promising them salvation through blood. They marched toward the lower districts to crush the uprising before it could breathe. Jace and Sarai stood at the heart of the foundry, surrounded by workers who now armed themselves with tools turned into weapons. The humans carried fusion cutters. The aliens held iron rods and welding torches. They had nothing polished, nothing noble, but their eyes burned brighter than any ceremonial armor. Sarai looked at them, her voice soft but unwavering. I do not want war, but I will not bow to chains any longer. My mother died because they feared what I might become. They said, I was weak, yet I stand before you now because a human believed I could, and if I can stand so, can all of you. The roar that followed shook the walls and carried through the night like thunder. When the first wave of soldiers arrived, they found not frightened laborers, but a wall of fire and steel. Jace led from the front, his hands guiding the defense like a craftsman, orchestrating a symphony. He rerouted the power lines through the foundry's old reactors, turning the air thick with heat. When the soldiers charged, he activated the magnetic field, sending their own armor into disarray. The workers fought beside him, shouting the name of Sarai like a promise, while she stood above them, the silver light of her exoframe gleaming through the smoke. The battle raged for hours until the spy master himself entered the field. His body cracked but alive, his weapon humming with dark energy. He moved through the fire like a phantom, cutting through Jace's defenses. One by one, he shouted, "The Baron commands your surrender, daughter of lies." Sarai did not move. She stood at the balcony overlooking the chaos and answered in a voice that reached even his cold heart. "I am the daughter of truth. You murdered my mother and you crippled me. Because you feared what I could become, now you will see what you created." Voran raised his weapon, but Jace leapt between them. His body colliding with the spy master's frame, the two crashed against the steel floor, their struggle raw and merciless. Jace fought with nothing but his bare hands against metal limbs. He felt bones crack and heat burn his skin, but he refused to fall. He slammed his hand against the control plate on Voran's chest, overriding the power surge with the same rhythm. He had used to break the governor chip, the spy master screamed as his systems collapsed. Sparks flying from his eyes as Jace whispered for Sarai to run. She refused, her eyes burning with fury. She stepped down and placed her hand over the spy master's chest, sending a pulse of light through him. His body stiffened, then went still. The machine that had hunted her for years finally silent. The battle ended with the dawn, the soldiers retreating in confusion, the workers standing victorious among the ruins. Jace fell to his knees, his body trembling from exhaustion. Sarai rushed to him, catching him before he hit the ground. His face was pale, but his eyes still burned with life. She said through tears, "You cannot die now. We are not finished." He smiled, weakly, and whispered, "You already won, Sarai. You showed them what it means to be alive." When the sun rose over Velkaris, the people gathered in the great hall, not as servants, but as witnesses. The Baron stood on his throne, pale, furious, his once proud voice reduced to trembling rage. He demanded his daughter kneel before him, but she entered the hall, walking without assistance. The entire court gasped, her frame gone, her steps steady. Every noble felt the weight of that sound, her bare feet striking the marble like a declaration. She stood before her father and said, "You told them I was cursed, yet I have walked through your lies, and I am still standing." The priest dared not speak. The soldiers lowered their weapons. The silence that followed was thicker than fear. The Baron looked at his daughter, then at the human standing beside her, bruised, bleeding, but unbroken. He spat his final words, "You are no daughter of mine." Sarai raised her head and answered, "No, I am not your daughter. I am the heir of every voice you silenced and the guardian of every soul you bound." She turned to the court, her eyes fierce as she spoke. Let him be judged not by blood but by truth. The nobles looked among themselves, and for the first time in memory, they refused the command of their lord. They stripped his crest from his robe and cast it upon the floor. The Baron lunged for his blade, but Jace stepped forward despite his wounds blocking the strike. Sarai raised her hand and the crest network responded. To her call, the holographic sigil of her house blazed above her head, brighter than any star. She declared that the barony belonged not to one man but to all who labored beneath its suns. Her voice carried through every speaker, every device across. The moon and the people answered with a single unified cry for the air. In that moment the old order crumbled and something new began. Jace fell to one knee, unable to stand any longer. But when Sarai turned and extended her hand, he took it and rose. Beside her together they faced the dawn, not as servant and mistress but as equals bound by faith and fire. The Baron's guard surrendered, the nobles bent their heads, and Sarai Kavrek, the once paralyzed daughter of mockery, became the living symbol of a world reborn, a throne reclaimed, and a choice made. The dawn that broke over Velkaris that day was unlike any other in memory. The sky bled gold and violet, as if the world itself struggled to wake from a long nightmare. Smoke rose from the broken towers of the palace, But within the wreckage, something new stirred the sound of people gathering, the echo of voices. Not in fear, but in wonder. For the first time, the air carried no songs of praise to the Baron, no hollow prayers to the priests, only the murmurs of change spreading like the first breath after drowning. Sarai stood upon the steps of the great hall, her body still weak, her frame cracked from the night's battle, but her head held high. The nobles who had survived the chaos gathered below her silent, their silks torn, their crowns dim. Jace stood beside her. His arm bandaged his face, pale from exhaustion, yet his eyes never left her. He had seen her crawl through despair, rise through fire, and now stand in the light of her own making behind them. The workers, the servants, and the soldiers who had chosen to lay down their weapons filled the courtyard, their faces turned upward, waiting for her voice. She looked over them, and for a moment said nothing, only breathed in the weight of what had been lost and what had been won. Then she spoke, her voice low at first, but carrying with the strength of truth. I was born into chains wrapped in gold. My body made a prison for the comfort of men who feared a woman's power. I was called cursed and hidden from the world, but you saw me. You all saw what they tried to bury, and you stood with me when no one else would. Her words trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer force of emotion behind them. The nobles shifted, uncertain whether to bow or to run. Some looked to the Baron, still kneeling at the base of the stairs. His hands bound his face, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. He spat words of venom, calling her usurper, traitor, abomination, but none listened. His voice was no louder than a whisper against the chorus of the people. Sarai stepped down until she stood before him, her gaze steady and without hate. Father, she said, you ruled through fear and deceit. You called it order. You called it law. But it was only silence forced upon the living today that silence ends. The Baron glared up at her, expecting death, his eyes full of the pride that refused to break. But Sarai shook her head. I will not kill you, she said. I am not your reflection. You will live not as a lord, but as an exile among those you once enslaved. Learn what it means to work, to bleed, to build, if you can find your soul again. Then perhaps the gods you worship might finally listen. The crowd gasped for mercy was rarer than victory, but her choice struck deeper than any execution. It was justice born of compassion and vengeance, tempered by wisdom. Jace watched her and felt something inside him shift. He had seen leaders rise and fall across the stars, but none like her. She had no armies, no fleets, only a heart that refused to bend. The people began to kneel, not in submission, but in respect, a sea of bowed heads shining under the morning light. Sarai turned to Jace, and for a moment the weight of everything fell away. She smiled faintly. You once told me I could walk through their lies, she said. Now I will ask you to walk with me. He bowed his head and answered, I will as long as I have breath. She reached for his hand, helping him to his feet, the touch simple but heavy with the promise of a new beginning together. They entered the hall where the throne of Velkaris waited, shattered from the night before. She did not sit upon it. Instead, she stepped past it and turned to the assembly. This seat was built to raise one above all others, she said. But I have learned that no ruler stands alone from this day. The council of Velkaris shall be built from every hand that labors, every voice that dares to speak. No more bloodlines, no more chains. The priests protested, but the people shouted them down. The air trembled with the roar of unity. Sarai raised her arms, not in command, but in thanks, tears glimmering in her eyes as she whispered to herself, for my mother, for those who could not stand. Jace moved through the crowd, repairing systems, reconnecting power, helping rebuild the shattered circuits of the Crest network. The same web that once carried lies now became a beacon, transmitting her message across the moon. The story of the broken air and the human maker spread to every settlement, every mine, every forgotten village. Weeks turned into months, and the world began to heal. The old banners were taken down, and new ones raised, bearing no crests, only the symbol of two hands joined. Sarai ruled not as queen, but as guardian, walking among her people. Instead of above them, the frame she once needed now stood displayed in the palace square, a monument not to weakness but to defiance. Jace built new limbs for children born with injuries, new exoframes for workers in the fields. He shared his designs, freely teaching both humans and aliens the art of repair, the art of creation. Every evening, Sarai came to his workshop. Her robes simple, her smile quiet. They spoke of the past and the future, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence. Jace would glance at the stars and tell her of Earth, though he had never seen it himself. She would listen, and then tell him of Valkaris before her father's rule, when rivers still ran clear and the people sang in the markets. One night she said softly, "I used to dream of walking the halls again. Now, I dream of walking among the stars beside you." He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes, and answered, "When that day comes, we will go together." Years passed, and stories of the human and the air traveled beyond Valkaris to distant colonies where rebellion stirred and whispered oaths. They became legend not for conquest, but for compassion for the way one human and one alien stood against the weight of empire and refused to break. And though their names faded with time, their legacy remained written in the freedom of those who came after them. In the final years of her life, Sarai walked the gardens. She had rebuilt where the flowers of two worlds bloomed together. She watched children run with mechanical limbs Jace had crafted. She heard laughter in the halls that had once echoed with cruelty. She turned to him one evening, her hair silver, her face calm, and said, "Do you remember when they called me a curse?" He smiled, his hand still stained with the ink of his work, and replied, "They were right. You were a curse upon their chains." She laughed softly, and for a moment, she was the same girl he had met long ago, trapped in a chair yet burning with silent strength. When she died, the people of Valkaris mourned not a ruler but a mother, a friend, a builder. Her body was laid beneath the twin moons beside the workshop where it had all begun, and Jace continued her work until his hands could no longer hold tools. He passed quietly, surrounded by the hum of machines and the soft glow of her old frame, which still pulsed faintly, as if her spirit lingered in its circuits. Together their story became the heartbeat of Valkaris, a living legend whispered to every child that no joke, no cruelty, no cage could ever stop those who dared to see potential where others saw only brokenness. And through that truth, the stars themselves seemed to shine brighter,